the liberal order, but politically how it has threatened to this liberal order. So literally it was very insightful. Now welcome Rion to make any comment, remark on JS.
All right, thank you, Dr. Tripathi, and thank you so much for the speaker. I agree, this was very insightful. And again, there are two comments that I think I want to make. The first relates to what the speaker mentioned with regards to values being enforced within the nation state. I think that's quite an important point, because if we analyze China's own rise, we see that's exactly what they did. They first got their own house in order according to their own values, and they showed the world that their model works according to the outcomes that they've set. They wanted a moderately prosperous society by 2020, and they now have one. In 30 years, they've grown. And so I think there's a lot to be said for first getting your own domestic model right, which we know that the US, being the prime proponent of democracy, as shown earlier this year, just is not. It does not have its house in order. So I really appreciate that that was added to the analysis. And I think there are many countries in the region that could benefit from that approach in sort of model-based leadership. The second point I want to make is sorry, there seems to be, all right. So the second point I want to make, the author briefly mentioned BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and obviously I think that's going to become a very key point of not just China studies, but because the BRI reaches all the way into Europe, it's going to become a Eurasian, North African topic within the next decade if China continues to push that. So I think it's quite relevant. But a point I want to make there, I think it's important when we're analyzing the BRI as one of the manifestations of a more assertive China, that we also realize that when China moves out in the BRI, they're also taking on additional responsibility and risk for themselves. Because they've up until now mostly focused within their own nation, and they've been able to maintain political control because the CCP has a lot of control within its own borders. But then once you start moving out, once you start linking your economy so tangibly to all the economies and nations along the BRI road, you then have to ensure that they remain stable in and of themselves. And so I think that the Chinese government is going to also take on a lot of risk, even though it's becoming more assertive. And so it would be interesting to analyze how the Chinese in themselves reflect on this and how they change the way they interact with the international order. Do they become more interventionist? Because up until now, they've been quite, they've had a policy of non-interference. We don't interfere in your domestic politics. But what happens when you start linking your economic prosperity to BRI, and you build roads, you build bridges, and now a country's political system becomes unstable, war breaks out? Do you still say, okay, we don't care about the domestic situation? No, then you have to actually intervene. So it's quite interesting how that is going to play into the analysis. So I'm curious how that links into this topic. I think those are my only two remarks. So Professor Rahman.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. Rion. I would continue from where you just left. So one of the criticisms, or rather one of the concerns actually of the scholarly community as far as the BRI is concerned, is China actually exporting some of the problems that its developmental model has in its domestic arena to the West, to the BRI countries? That is the question that it has to contend with. Now, given the very unique authoritarian party state model that China has, it is able to, to manage the various contradictions that its development model has in the name of quote unquote socialism with Chinese characteristics, or the so-called socialist market economy. But how do you basically contend with the fact that you believe in a policy of non-interference, and yet at the same time your investments are going to be inextricably linked with economies which are not necessarily donning the same political color which you have, and that is China has. So managing this contradiction is going to be extremely critical. How does it do that? And apart from, and so sometimes one might see shades of assertiveness also manifesting from its inability to balance this non-interference, and yet at the same time managing the stakes it has because of the investments it has made in the BRI. So that is something which we all have to look forward to. I'll stop here.
So thank you, Dr. Rahman, for your comments. Now I would like to welcome Deepika. She is a doctoral candidate, Department of Law, Jammu University. So now Deepika is here. Hello. Am I audible? Hello.
Yes, you are audible.
Anadi. The next speaker. Okay. The next speaker we have Anadi. She is a MPhil student from Jawaharlal Nehru University. So Anadi, are you here?
Yes, sir.
So please, you can do the presentation.
Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you, chair, co-chair, and the organizers for this opportunity to speak. And good afternoon to everyone. And I think I'm audible, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because there's some connectivity issue here, so pardon me for that.
You are
So,
audible.
okay, so the title of my paper is SEO in Central Asia, Threat to the Liberal International Norms and the Rise of China's Principle. So as we are aware of the fact that after the Second World War, the world kind of became bipolar, and later with the disintegration of USSR, there was an emergence of unipolarity in the world, and since then there has been growing influence of liberal international order throughout the world, and any other perspective was kind of not able to challenge its fundamentals. But however, with the rise of China, there have been many suggestions regarding the contestation of Chinese norms with the Western ideas of international relations and cooperation. And Central Asian region itself has become a place where the contestation between these two perspectives can be seen, where the norms of SEO is gaining more importance than the liberal norms. Therefore, among these concerns, there are emerging questions regarding the feasibility and future of liberal international order in Central Asia, and more importantly, throughout the world. So it also necessitates the analysis of implication of acceptance of non-Western Chinese norms in this Central Asian region. So in this paper, firstly, I have dealt with the conceptual understanding of the new regionalism, and later I have also dealt with the contestation regarding norm creation in the Central Asian region. And at the same time, I have also highlighted the efforts of SEO in challenging the liberal international order. And finally, I've also analyzed the implication of such norm creation for other reasons as well. So beginning with my paper, regionalism is I first explain what's regionalism and new regionalism. So regionalism is a kind of a major cause of the evolution of regional organization, and it is an ideology that somewhere emphasizes on the national interest of a particular region or group of regions. And on the one hand, new regionalism is a post-Cold War construct which argues for the consensus-based cooperation, and globalization has played an important role in the promotion of new regionalism. And the creation of SCO, that is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, can also be traced to the new regionalism. And SU has been established in order to ensure peace and security and enhancement of trade, cultural, and humanitarian connections among the Eurasian region. And at the initial stage in SEO, there were 5 members that includes China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. And many Western analysts have viewed the SEO as an anti-Western bloc of China and Russia to kind of counter US presence in Central Asia. And even this organization has also been declared as the Dictators Association. So in this context of great power relation, the SEO majorly performs 3 roles. Firstly, it somewhere builds relation between Beijing and Moscow, and secondly, SEO also serves as a symbol of a form of international security cooperation in which United States does not play a leading role. And finally, with the help of SEO, the China can also go beyond the triangle of Russia, China, and USA and focus on the Middle East and African regions. And in addition to that, in future, China China can also use SU in other parts of the world for its diplomatic purposes. So in basically in international arena, the norm setting is something which is unending and perpetual practice. And norms are in the form of shared ideas, expectations, and beliefs about appropriate behavior, and they give world structure, order, and stability. So the Central Asia has become a reason where there is apparent contestation and conflict between different approaches of international norms, and that can be easily seen. For on the one hand, there is Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that is OSCE, and while on the other there is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that is SCO. And these both institutions have significantly affected the norm creation in this specific region, and for this particular purpose they have been continuously engaging with the political elites of Central Asia. In Central Asia, OSCE came on the international radar around 90s with the disintegration of USSR, and its primary focus has been to ensure democratization. And the norm setting approach of OSCE can be understood from its objective, at it has been argued that OSCE was a toolkit for supporting democratization in the region. However, it has been widely argued that except Kyrgyzstan, all the states have not been able to absorb the tenets of international liberal order. And on the other hand, Shanghai Cooperation Organization that has been comparatively more successful in ensuring its own norm creation in the Central Asia region. And most of the research has been concerned about how international organization has been helpful in promoting democracy or in promoting democratization process. But on the other hand, we haven't looked much into the question that how international organization helps in sustaining autocracy. So like authoritarian government, for example, they utilizes these multilateral cooperation to defend themselves against regional or global democratic trends. For instance, we can take the example of SCO, and as it has been clearly written in the declaration that establishes SCO, the Shanghai spirit has majorly 6 components. First, mutual trust, mutual benefit, equality, consultation, respect for multi-civilization, and striving for common development. And SU has been seen as an outgrowth of China's new security concept, and this is being formulated in opposition to American-dominated power-based international system. And a close examination of the 2001 declaration that establishes SU and its 2002 charter provides an interesting insight into the norms and values of the organization. That is, unlike the charter of European Union or Organization for American States or the African Union for that matter, there is no commitment to democratic values in the SCO charter, and its founding document are completely devoid of any mention of democracy. Instead, respect of state sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs of members are highlighted. And these statements kind of advances the illegitimacy of any state that affects or even comments on the domestic governance of organizations members, and thus it has somewhere undermined the democratization process or attempts of regime change, as well as even the criticism of political or human rights policies of member states. In fact, if one looks at the SEO document, SEO can be seen as the institutionalization of the opposition of Moscow and Beijing to the American dominated unipolar international order. So the changes in international order are somewhere rooted in the current power transition that is taking place, as power is diffusing from what was considered as a global transatlantic core to the global south. And both Russia and increasingly China have been viewed as the main revisionist challenges to the liberal international order. And the main vehicle for these counter ordering efforts have been new economic or security regional organizations that is being established by Moscow and Beijing to project their agendas and even check the influence of Western counterparts. For Russia, this has included founding the Collective Security Treaty Organization, that is CSTO, as a regional security alternative to NATO. And for China, the most important of these new organizations is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that was founded in 2001. So even if we trace the trajectory, the Central Asian states attend more summits, working groups, and inter-agency groups convened by Russia and China than they do for the Liberal Ordering Organization. And SCO's Shanghai spirit implicitly criticizes the universality of political liberalism while emphasizing the importance of authoritarian counter norms like sovereignty, civilizational diversity, and traditional values. And in the 2000, the like as a good providers, Russia and China somewhere has broken the Western monopoly of as a good provider, and Chinese and Russians loans also do not carry those same types of liberalizing demands either in the economy or political sphere as their Western counterparts mostly do. And Central Asian governments also have taken steps to curtail the activities of Western NGOs, which they now regard as a potential threat to regime security. Therefore, the Central Asia has somewhere absorbed the norms of SEO because it does not compel them to practice the ideas of democracy and transparency, and they are free to adopt policies which is in their own interest. So to sum up or to conclude my paper, I like to mention that there have been there are many reasons which have seen the changes in the political landscape because of the disintegration of USSR, and a unipolar world itself has been subjected to the norms of international liberal order. But the Central Asian region has been a kind of a battleground for the contestation between Western international ideas and the new norms that are being propagated by the SCO. So the particular political context of Central Asian countries have been conducive to the objectives of SEO, and they have significantly absorbed the new norms of China. And with the rise of political and economic dominance of China in future, the other reason might also come in the ambit of SEO. And as far as Central Asian region is concerned, it is quite evident that the ideas of political elite of Central Asian countries are somewhere in more consonance with the ideas or the objective of SEO. So yeah, that's all about the paper. So thank you so
So
much.
thank you. Thank you, Nadi. Really, you have touched upon the vast area of a liberal order. The one side, Russia and China, the way threatened in terms of the politically does not any have a regard for democracy, rule of law, and freedom of dissent, voicing. And the other side, on security front, they are promoting international organization, and economic front, they are supporting the open trade and all that. At the same time, the Central Asia has become as a battleground for both for the universalization of liberal order and the one side the SEO norms. So beautifully, yeah, you are remarkable to your presentation was remarkable. Now, I would like to invite Riwan for any remarks on this paper.
Thank you, Dr. Tripathi, and thank you to the author. I don't have many remarks, but I do think this paper particularly touches on a very important topic in international relations that I think is very understudied, which is regionalism, and as the author mentioned, new regionalism. Because there was always the assumption, I think this assumption is inherent in the liberal order, that multilateralism equals good. So for the last few decades, multilateralism and multilateral platforms have always equaled better. It's always a step up from the nation state. So it's very interesting that the author points out and particularly focus on the adverse effects of multilateralism, and that authoritarian governments can use these platforms as well, and they can use them effectively. And I think something that's very interesting is the link between the role that the way that the state views itself and the kind of regional organizations it then creates. Because as the authors pointed out, the nature of the regional organization is very much a product of its member states itself. So the member state can mold and feed its own values into the structures and institutions, like, for example, the SCO for China. And what I think is interesting there is that the way that Russia and China views themselves and their relationship to democracy and their political systems is very much in relation to how they view themselves as quote unquote civilizations. They almost see these things, these political values, as antithetical to the civilizational values of their traditions, and they view it as part of Western civilization. So they don't see a need to embrace that, and so it kind of is interesting that then feeds into their regional organizations. Yeah, I would just like to commend the paper. I'm pretty sure Professor Rahman will have interesting insights to share on this as well.
No, I think thanks a lot. Rion, due to shortage of time, I would reserve some of my comments, but largely agree with whatever Rion has said. That this is a very, very critical subject, and not much has been done in this particular area. So, in fact, at a MPhil level, Anadi, you are venturing into something which is not much of an explored area. It needs a lot of encouragement, and I'm sure your supervisor and other people around you would encourage you to dig deeper. So keep up the good work, and that's all I can say as of now.
Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to invite Deepika. Deepika Badhyal is here. Deepika, are you here? She would be the last speaker. She's here, I think. Her name is Sonia. Deepika, are you getting my voice? Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, Dr. Tripathi, you are.
I think Deepika Badhyal, if you are here, please start your
Deepika needs to
presentation.
Unmute herself.
Deepika, please try to unmute yourself.
May I start it, sir?
Okay, now good.
Am I audible?
Yeah, sure, please start. Yeah,
okay,
you are doing.
Namaste. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Deepika Badhyal, and I'm going to present my paper on REEs. The title of my paper is Quad to Counter the Chinese Hegemony in Rare Earths, an urgency to take a harder stand against China. So before I begin, it is important. Am I visible? Should I proceed?
Deepika, you visible. Yes, yes,
okay.
Yes, please.
Okay. So to begin with, it is important to understand what REEs are. REEs basically is an acronym for rare earth elements. And China has seized the global attention by exhibiting its dominance in rare earths. Before I begin, let me explain what REEs are. They are 17 important minerals that are not easily found in most parts of the world because they are typically dispersed. And they are found in the deepest layers of the earth. And basically, it is the scarcity of these minerals which is sending the global leadership into frenzy. That is why in a recently held Quad summit, the Quad leaders mulled building a supply chain for REEs to end the Chinese dominance in this sector. Over time, China has acquired the precision on the whole process of separation and purification of these rare earth metals. In my paper, I'm going to explore why REEs are significant and how they are geostrategically going to shape the world and how Quad can tackle the Chinese massive ambitions of global domination in REEs. So it is important to note that without REEs, our iPhones cannot function, airports would not work, and neither would wind turbines. This is because for all of them to work, they need to be powered by RPEM, which means rare earth permanent magnets, which are the most powerful permanent magnets. As of 2018, China has 44 million tons or 36.7% of the world's rare earth deposits. Brazil has 22%, Vietnam has 18%, Russia 10%, and India has 5.8%. The rest of the world, including the US and Japan, have 10.9% of rare earths. According to the US Geological Survey, China in 2020 accounted for 58% of the global rare earth production, down from around 90% some 4 years ago, as the US and the Australia have gradually boosted their own production. That is why Quad has come into picture, because they obviously would not want China to take over the world in terms of REEs as well. So China has positioned its rare earths as strategic resource and has used its near monopoly as a diplomatic bargaining chip. In 2010, supplies of Chinese rare earths to Japan came to a halt after Tokyo nationalized the islands. Japan says its sovereignty over the East China is not under dispute, but China, which claims the islands and calls them a Daewoo, reacted angrily. When China halted rare earth shipments, prices of some of the metals skyrocketed near ninefold, and it appears China is not finished engaging in rare earth diplomacy. Recently, US President Joe Biden has also mandating a 100-day review of critical product supply chains, which included REEs as well. So as for REEs, the core nations will first develop refining technologies. Rare earth veins often contain radioactive materials, and a large amount of radioactive waste is produced in the refining process, which is what China basically dominates. Also, China is leading its way in rare earth metals because of its environmental restrictions as well. I mean, it has lax environmental restrictions. China has built upon a price advantage in the rare earth market. As a result, the Quad countries will focus on coming up low-cost, low radioactive waste refinement for the government loans to the mining and the refining businesses. The US government is already supporting plans to process the Australian ores in the US, and the Japan is also weighing whether to take part in the arrangement. Recently, the International Energy Agency intends to establish rules to stop China's export controls. India is not a member of the IEA, but in January, at the behest of Japan, because these countries are collaborating in Quads, so at the behest of Japan, the US and Australia, New Delhi and the IEA has entered into a strategic partnership, strengthening their collaboration across a range of vital areas, including REEs. So according to the data from the US Geological
Deepika, kindly unmute yourself. Deepika. Okay.
Am I audible now?
Okay. Please.
Okay. So according to the data, according to the US Geological Survey, the US accounted for 16% of global rare earth production in 2020, Australia accounted for 7.1%. While India accounts total world's rare earth reserves, it hasn't explored the area yet. Japan is also one of the biggest rare earth consumers. If the Quad nations can collaborate all along the chain from production to consumption, their influence in the their influence in the critical sector will rise. So Quad nations. Am I audible?
Yes,
I'm so sorry. I'm having connectivity issues, so please bear with me.
Okay, no issue. No issue.
Yeah. Okay, so India basically has more rare earth deposits than both Australia and US combined. Why it is important geostrategically, we need to understand they are not found in most part of the world. Also, the process to obtain the rare earths is environmentally destructive and produces various radioactive waste. Increasingly, countries around the world have gone away. Am I audible and visible at the same time? Because I'm not sure what is going on. Yeah, so increasingly countries around the world have gone away from refining metals like these. China has environmental laws and has endless expanses of deserts and areas where nobody lives. So deliberately, China has made its environmental laws such that it could pollute as no one else could. And other countries who mine these minerals could send it to China to process, so that China can take leverage. China also has leveraged its environmental laws by way of an indirect ecological subsidy in the rare metal industry. However, the turning point came in 2010 when the world realized that China had a crippling monopoly where it could punish any country by controlling the supply of the rare earth metals. China that year in 2010, China also stopped its supply of rare earths to Japan after they had quite a tiff at the Senkaku Islands. So in today's time, while Japan has managed to cut down its dependence on Chinese rare earths to 60% from 91%, the US. It is significant to note that US still relies on China for 80% of its rare earth needs. See, rare earth metals are a strategic asset. So one has to see its natural wealth as a strategic asset and the lack of it as a strategic liability. It is important for India as well to use its natural asset as a strategic asset. Despite more than the US, India only mined 3,000 tons of rare earth in 2020, while the Western nation has mined 38,000 tons. Meanwhile, Australia mined 17,000 tons and China mined 140,000 tons. The same year, US had 16% of the production of the rare earth metals. Australia had 7%, while India was at 1%. So these four countries basically have come together this time openly. They have this one agenda to stop China's effort to dominate Indo-Pacific. China's expansionism threat is not new, and neither the Quad. However, in the past, the group has been shy of openly declaring its intentions. This is the first time since 2017 that these countries have come together in an international forum. So the first, to go back in history, the first Quad summit happened on the sidelines of the Asian Forum. Since then, the idea of the alliance has been around, made news, but fallen short of taking any substantive action. This time they have come around amidst, pandemic. It shows that there is an urgency to stop China and to stop its hegemony in various sectors, but especially in rare earths. So since then, as basically a decade later, though the alliance was resurrected in 2017, and the members of Quad had a working level meeting, but now, since America is not soft on China, and Australia has already named the Asian giant in its strategic assessment. Australia's Department of Defense has already said that the China is engaged in active pursuit of a greater influence in the Indo-Pacific. It is from the India's point of view, it is important that India takes control, because India has already locked in a border standoff with China. More than 1,000 of Chinese apps have been banned. Also, if we look at Japan, its territorial disputes in the East China Sea, they keep on flaring up. So, but kudos to Japan that it proposed this alliance, and now it has become the host also. The US, Australia, India, and Japan, they have basically recently joined hands to build a rare earth procurement chain to counter the dominance China plays in supplying these crucial elements to makers of everything from smartphones to high performance motors to EV batteries. AI and artificial intelligence is also going to be the reality of the new world, and these rare earth metals are heavily used in AI as well. So China currently produces nearly 60%, as I already told you, and its market power has posed supply concerns. The quadrilateral security dialogue nations intend to counter this by cooperating in funding new production technologies and development projects. So they have confirmed their intentions already to reduce their dependence on China-produced rare earths. Big tech companies also rely on China-produced rare earths like neodymium, which is essential for electric vehicles. So the world's #2 economy I have mentioned it many a times, it has a near monopoly on the separation also. It doesn't only have its dominance on the extraction, but it also hijacked the whole process on the separation and purification processes that create concerns regarding environment and soil damage. It has less control in mining these elements, but the US exports domestically produced rare earth ores to China. It is important to see that on one hand, they are engaged in Cold War, and at the same time, they are heavily engaged with each other in terms of REEs. So China, as I told you, has already halted many programs, and these coordinations have come together to develop.
May I interrupt you, Deepika? Kindly summarize the beginning words.
Okay, sir. Just give me a second. Okay, I'm so sorry. I'll conclude just by saying that these Quad countries have potential to stop the dragon from exploiting the Vietnam and the countries like Vietnam and dictating their rules. What is important for the international order is that it needs to be reimagined, revised, and reformed. Thank you, Dr. Tripathi, for giving me this opportunity to speak before the August and the prestigious panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deepika, for your insightful presentation. Now this is done for chair and the co-chair. So I'd like to invite Mr. Rion for having chair remarks for this technical session. So kindly, Rion, this is your floors. And please conclude your remarks around 12 to 15 minutes, because we have already we have got late. So, and then the next co-chair we have also Dr. Raman. So please, you are welcome, Mr. Dio.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Tripathi. I will try to keep it brief so that we can respect time, and so that Professor Raman also has sufficient time for his remark. I think something that's come up through this entire session and also through yesterday's session is really that in the post-Cold War era, the United States was pushing this narrative of a global village, that the entire world was one village, and that we should move towards that. But I think what's evident from the conversation we've been having in the last 2 days is that the world is actually consists of multiple villages, and they're all developing on their own basis with their own norms, with their own values. And so I think a lot of the symptoms that we're discussing and the sort of ailments of the liberal international order are symptoms of our inability to realize this and our inability to accept this, and then to use that as the starting basis for our analyses of the world. And so conversations that we're having here are really crucial for refocusing our frame. And for young international relations scholars like myself, it's very exciting, because this is going to be what's going to influence our work for the next 30, 40 years. So from my perspective, I really think that it's important for us to realize that a lot of the current globalization and the current liberal order is based in a colonial past. We're sort of seeing the end of colonialism, even though colonialism in Africa, for example, ended in the 1960s, and that was the last place where it officially ended. The remnants of colonialism and its manifestations are still very much inherent in the way that the world works. And so we're seeing the systematic decolonization of the world, and this is pushing us into greater chaos, greater uncertainty, because now we need to reassess and sort of reevaluate the global consensus that seemed obvious 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so in doing that, I think something that's becoming very important when we think of the rise of China and Russia is that those countries which espouse liberal values, so many countries in Africa, for example, South Africa is one example, India is an example, we've mentioned many Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, and then of course America and Australia, are proponents of a certain kind of way of life, a certain political kind of way of life that's based on, at least in principle, human rights and democracy. But I think something that's becoming very clear is that unless we get our own houses in order, unless we can create, yesterday it was mentioned, we need a more inclusive globalization, and we need a more inclusive liberal order. And I think that's very true, because even though we say the liberal order consists of America, India, Australia, South Africa, we know that within that mix, there's a colonial hierarchy of power that we assume that, okay, well, the Americans and the French and the UK and Australia, they're going to lead the liberal order. So the African perspective, the Indian perspective, the sort of global South perspective, you guys are sort of just coming along. We're just inviting you along on our journey. When I think in reality, what's becoming evident is that if we want a new consolidated identity that proposes a liberal norm-based world order, these countries need to critically look at themselves. They need to find their own voices. And I think we see the rise of identity politics as a very important element in the sort of liberal world. We see it in America, the BLM movement. We see it in Europe with the rise of populism. And we see it in Africa as well, where there's sort of a pan-African rising. Now, of course, these phenomena are on different sides of the political spectrum. Some of them are extreme left, some of them are extreme right. But I think they come from the same place, is all the societies are trying to come to terms with globalization and find out, but where do I fit in? And I think one of the key things that China has done, and Russia to an extent as well, is they've managed to define for themselves where they believe they fit. And so they've then gone about their strategies based on that conceptualization of who they are and where they fit. And so this is leading very much to, I think, what would classically be called the clash of civilizations. You have the old Western liberal order clashing with these new identities rising, with what we call China the dragon, or the great Russian bear rising up. But I think that we as international relations scholars also, it's very important for us to realize that we're not demagogues, or ideologues rather. We're not ideologues, and so we must be very critical in thinking about, is there a path dependency in this clash of civilizations? Because I think if the last few years with the Trump and Brexit and COVID have taught us anything, is that nothing in the international system is inevitable. Nothing will last forever. If we don't maintain it through norm creation, through upholding our institutions, everything eventually falls apart. And so as the nations that propose and support a liberal international order in opposition to the authoritarian model that's perhaps being pushed by China and Russia, I think something that continuously comes up from the papers and the information that's being presented, that was presented in this panel today, is that there's a serious reassessment necessary. And we also need to reassess how this international order relates to China and Russia. They are not inherent threats, at least from my perspective. They're not inherent threats. They do pose certain threats to components of the liberal international order, but the idea that they're a threat is a constructed idea. And so we need to look at what are the motivations, what are the ways of thinking that influence this perception. At the same time, we should recognize that we don't want to go back to a pre-World War II world where we lose the fundamental progress that's been made in human civilization as a whole, in respect for human rights. Never in history has the world been at a place where we respected human rights, or at least in principle, committed ourselves to human rights the way we do now, to a liberal-based order, to the idea that the people should rule. I mean, even in China, I think it's important to note that though they do not support a democratic system in the way of electoral democracy, they would argue that they do support a kind of democracy because all of their policies are focused on uplifting the everyday person. So they still focus their policies. Whether that's democracy, I think, is a different debate, but we should recognize that this is the current standpoint. We recognize that the everyday man, rather than the elites or so, has a specific place and a role to play. And so just in concluding there, as I mentioned, I think it's important that we recognize that we need to reevaluate and reach a new global consensus. And anybody who resists that is, in its sense, because we've used the word before in the panel, is revisionist. And I think anybody who resists the fact that we need a new consensus is revisionist and is attempting to hold on to some kind of, whether you call it the Russian Empire, whether you call it socialist China, whether you call it neo-colonial West, all of them, we need to, as international relations scholars, move away from that and move towards this place where we can look at them all from a, I don't want to say objective, because we do all look at it from our own perspective, but from a position where we can critically look at them rather than looking at the so-called narratives, because the globalization that we're currently facing is disruptive to everyone. So there's no like characterization where we can say, oh, the rising dragon or the great Western powers who are defending liberty. These are simplistic narratives, and we really need to resist them as far as possible. So I'd like to give over to Professor Rahman for his remarks, and I'd just like to say thank you very much for allowing me to chair the session. It's very insightful. Thank you, Dr. Chapati, for doing the effort of including African voices. As I mentioned, in future, I hope more African voices can participate in your conferences.
Thank you, Mr. Rion. It's really very insightful for us. We are very glad to have your perspective, African perspective, that you mentioning that nothing is inherent threat from China and Russia, as there is a threat from all corner, even the threat those who are the anchor of this liberal order since 1945. So thank you for your wonderful, insightful observation on this liberal order. And now I would like to welcome and invite Professor Venkataraman to have remarks on this.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to the organizer of the conference. Thank you, Dr. Sandeep, for having me here. Thank you, Rion, for your very interesting remarks. Again, due to shortage of time, I would like to, maybe I would not sound so much of, I won't be able to coherently present my views. But however, I'll restrict my views to China because, frankly speaking, I don't know much of what's happening in Russia. So, from China's perspective, it's very interesting. The title of this particular session: China and Russia, do they threaten existing order? It looks as if it's straight away a kind of a topic from the National Security Strategy Report in 2017, where both these countries were termed revisionist powers and strategic competitors for the US. So when we say threat for whom? I mean, unless COVID happened, where China in multiple fronts started to, assert itself. Before that, it was threat only to the US apparently, right? So just because, that as long as you're okay with US, it's fine. As long, the moment you basically, flex your muscles in the international system, then, you are a threat. So therefore, threat to whom, and who is the one who actually portrays that China is a threat or it's not a threat? That is something which is pretty debatable. Second is we're talking about liberal order. Which order are we talking about? I mean, we know that, all these years, America has been a benevolent hegemon for sure, but this benevolence has increasingly faded into insignificance. And all that, one can see is that a certain kind of intolerance that an established hegemon is being, challenged by aspiring hegemons. And definitely China takes the lead there. Now, where is the threat coming from? Now, you see, if you have someone like Trump in democratic countries, you have free press, you have New York Times, Washington Post, you have CNN. So you have voices where the rest of the world will be knowing what's happening inside the United States. But if you're talking about China, the threat comes from here, that we don't know what happens, what are the Chinese planning beyond the Politburo Standing Committee. And that is the uncertainty itself is a huge threat to that. Right now, going forward, the cup is half empty or half full. Now, what the world sees as threat, we also need to understand that how does the Chinese look at the whole world? What is their perspective? So you cannot, as I always say, you look at China as a friend or you look at as an adversary. It's very important to understand what is their perspective of things. And so therefore, for example, what you and me say that they are threat, the Chinese consensus among their foreign policy decision-making is that there seems to be a very clear disjuncture of the US-dominated global governance system today. So they claim that Chinese assertiveness is directed against the contemporary global governance architecture because it predominantly reflects what? Reflects the declining US preferences and an outdated post-Second World War power distribution. China's assertiveness today basically conveys its entitlement to wield a higher degree of influence in making new policies, having a more democratic system in the international arena whereby international regimes are formed. And it is the global financial crisis actually which triggered, China, which basically witnessed a voice that emerged from China very explicitly. What are its quote unquote core interests? And ever since Xi Jinping was elevated as President and General Secretary of the party, this core interest has got converted into what we call the striving for achievements. Interestingly, from the Chinese perspective, the Chinese have always felt that every time they have asserted them by themselves, they have found themselves to be in a better bargaining position in the international system. So there are two ways of looking at, the current disturbances that arise from or stem from China's wolf warrior diplomacy, as they call it. Number one, it's possible that, due to inward-looking America and, making America great again, growing protectionism, there seems to be, as I said earlier, a very clear decline in capacity for sure. And I suppose to a certain extent, intent as well. When Trump says that, you cannot have a free security umbrella, you have to pay for it, it definitely indicates a decline in capacity. So when your intent and capacity both are challenged today, obviously what we see today is a certain kind of power vacuum. And once you have a certain kind of power vacuum, Chinese are experts in sensing that. And perhaps one way to look at their recent assertiveness and their claims to have a greater stake in the system, you can look at the long march strategy, which is taking one step forward and moving two steps backward. It's a classic guerrilla warfare tactics, whereby they are looking at the power vacuum and they are trying to see, how does the world react to their assertiveness? And in this whole process, whatever chaos comes in, can they basically come up with a better bargaining strategy, given that the whole world is dealing with this pandemic? And if you look at, their internal decision-making, the growing centralization in decision-making, the changes in foreign policy decision-making as far as bureaucratic structures within China is concerned, there's a very clear, shift towards centralization. And if not for Corona, the world would have witnessed the same kind of assertiveness 3-4 years from now. Now, what Corona has done is one has seen a premature announcement of this assertiveness. Given that, they have been pushed to the brink, they are now talking about it, and they are, being increasingly vocal. And, if you people have seen some of the videos which have been played around, the way China is talking to the Biden, administration, you must have seen, some of you, how Blinken was being spoken to in no uncertain terms. The fact that, they are able to speak with so much of confidence and are in no mood to accommodate, or I wouldn't say no mood to accommodate, they are in no mood to, accede to whatever the Americans say. That is something which will definitely lead to certain elements coming from them, which will definitely be anti-status quo for sure. Now, coming to speak of Quad, and I'll end here, because the last paper was on Quad. It's interesting to see that, yeah, Quad is there to contain China. But the point is, if you look at Japan, so I don't know how many of you would have noted that when China interfered in Hong Kong big time during the pandemic, Shinzo Abe was very quiet. It needed the G7 to give him a push, to speak something about, and to criticize China. It is only then that Shinzo Abe spoke. So therefore, due to the RCEP, Japan has major economic, interests when it comes to China. As far as India is concerned, no matter how much adversarial China is, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we don't have the option of dealing with China the way, we can't be dismissive about it. That is for sure. So that is, India has, for its own geostrategic interests, has to continuously engage with China, and it cannot afford to antagonize China beyond a certain point. And if you look at United States, again, United States needs China for climate change, for the Korean Peninsula peace talks. And then if you look at Australia, its economy is already in deep trouble because of, the punishment that it has been meted out due to it trying to being the voice of America being in the immediate neighborhood. So therefore, to what extent each of these countries can afford to be dismissive about their bilateral interests vis-a-vis China and come together and form a solid alliance? The Quad is not an alliance. Let us not try to forget it. So given this, definitely, there will be a lot of, seesaw battle, and definitely we can see in the next 10 years or so, the rules of the game will be very dynamic. And it all depends on to what extent the world at large is able to deal with China, which has, very deeply dug its heels in the global value chains. So China perhaps knows that, the way the globalized world is interconnected, it has dug its heels too deep. And so therefore, it can perhaps escape from the mild reprimands. It considers mild reprimands from how the world has been critical of its handling of COVID. So therefore, China looks at the whole world and says that you need me more than I need you. And so therefore, come on, let's negotiate and give me a larger share of the pie. And if that leads to so-called threat to the international order, Chinese are not concerned. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Venkatrama, for your very insightful observation and remarks on this third technical session of the international conference. And really, you just reminded us to hear Joseph Nine Robert Cohen, the complex interdependence, that the trade diffuses the frozen conflict. And of course, as far as the China is concerned, the trade is something that can diffuse the political tension and the tension. So thank you, sir, very much for your insightful remarks on this technical session. And thank you, Rion, for having here for your insightful observation and remarks on this technical session. The topic was so important, resurgence of China and Russia. So I would like to thank once again for all presenters here, one by one, Dr. Shumant, and Professor N.B. Chandrakala, and Mr. Khatu Jayesh Jayaprakash, Anandi, and Deepika. All you have presented very well here, and the participants joining here are going to be very delighted. I hope that we have already got your perspective from Chinese perspective, from Venkat sir, and from the South African perspective, from the Rion, and of course all you the presenters, your own perspective for your paper. So thank you so much, and I would like to thanks once again for participants, paper presenters, and chair, the co-chair, on behalf of this CIPL, Center for International Politics and Law. So this is all about the third technical session. So thank you so much. But at the same time, as we know that the fourth session is a continuation of after the third session. So from the participants, of course, I would expect to be here to listen the fourth session, the fourth technical session. And for fourth technical session, we have a very, very renowned scholar from Switzerland, a Professor Stephanie Walter. We welcome you here, ma'am. Very good afternoon from Indian time today. And we welcome from Center for International Politics and Law, and as well as the Department of Political Science and Human Rights in Indira Gandhi National Tribal University. This 2 days conference, 2 days international conference, this is the fourth. We are going to start the fourth technical session, and we have a guest as the chair, Stephanie Walter. Thank you so much. I extend my warm welcome to be here, Professor Walter. Professor Anupam Sharma is here, and as is from the morning, since the morning is here. Thank you so much, Professor Sharma. And so participants, I would expect and I would love to be here if you are here, and to continue your presence and to listen the perspective from Switzerland, especially from the from Brexit and the post-Brexit phenomena from Professor Stephanie Walter. She has been known for her remarks for anti-globalization, backlash, anti-globalization, and she is known for post-Brexit remarks. She has conducted extensive research on EU and post-Brexit. So I would like to welcome Professor Stephanie Walter, as well as let me introduce about your academic profile. Professor Walter is a full professor for international relations and political economy at the Department of Political Science at the University of Zurich. She is also the director of the Center for Comparative and International Studies, CIS. Her areas of research interest are the anti-globalization backlash, international institutions, especially EU, European Union. So thank you so much. I welcome you here. And the participants of this fourth technical session, especially the presenters, we have Dr. Subir Kapoor. He is Assistant Professor of Political Science, School of Law, Bennett University, Noida. And the next presenters we have with us Swati Kumari. She is the doctoral candidate from the Center, from the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is a very learned speaker. And the third presenters we have is Dr. Sonia Burghill. She is Assistant Professor, Department of Psychology, then Vedic PG College, Uttar Pradesh. And we have next presenters from Brazil. We are very, very glad to welcome Emilio, as well as Natala Jones, Natala. For to both, I welcome here. Now we have the last speaker, Dr. Sumant. Okay, we have done already. Sumant has already done. So basically 4 speakers, the paper presenters here. So I welcome to all once again, and Stephanie Walter, Professor Stephanie Walter, as well as the participants, those who are joining since the morning. I really am very grateful for your presence to be here continuously. So thank you so much. And now the floor is, so let me summarize again the time slot for this technical session as we did the last 3 sessions. There is a 90 minutes Though we are getting late, like I think 20 minutes, but we will extend in the later. So 90 minutes are given to this fourth technical session. There are I think we have 4 speakers. So the 4 speakers are 10 minutes for the each speakers. So it means the 40 minutes. And then for each speaker, I would expect from our chairperson that she can make remarks for each speaker after the completing paper presentation. So the 15 minutes are allotted for the Q&A session. So I didn't get any question from that third technical session. I would love to welcome the Q&A questions from the participants for those 4 speakers today, what we have. This is the timeline slot. And the final, after the Q&A session, Professor Stephanie Walter will deliver her chair remarks on the topic, and she will have 15 minutes. We would love to listen her wide range expertise on post Brexit, and as well as the EU, as well as anti-globalization backlash. So thank you so much. Now the floor is yours, Professor Stephanie Walter. Now please take it over. Kindly unmute yourself, Professor Walter.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Dr. Tripathi, for inviting me to this very interesting session. Did you want me to start giving my remarks now, or do you want me to, like, I thought that we would have the presentations and then.
I think there is a network issue.
Okay, so then let me just say that I'm very grateful to be here, that I'm really curious to hear all the presentation. I think this is going to be a very interesting session, and I look forward to it.
Thank you. So I would like to invite first speaker, Dr. Subir Kumar is here. Dr. Subir Kumar. Okay, no issue. I think he will be joining later. So the next speaker we will have, I think I'll start from Emilio and Nantala. Since they joined since the morning, so now the time is have come for you. So please, this is your floor. Please start. Kindly unmute yourself. Jos Nantala, kindly unmute yourself.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Emilio. I hope you are all listening to me and Emilio well. Thanks. It's a great honor to be here in this prestigious event, very well conducted by Mr. Tripathi. And we would like to thank GLA University, also the chair and the co-chair, for this wonderful meeting that we are having here in India, in Mathura, at least online. We are present now in Mathura, the home of Lord Krishna.
Thank you, thank you.
So it's a great pleasure for us. We are from the study group on BRICS in São Paulo University, and we are longing to make this kind of engagement with other universities in BRICS countries. So, Emilio, maybe you should start for us to keep our pace, and then I come back in my part on the paper.
Great, thank you. I would also like to say that it's a pleasure for me being here. I believe this is a very important conference, and I would like to thank all the organizers for this opportunity. So in our paper, we have addressed the question if trade war exposes a conflict of perspective between BRICS countries and WTO rules. And for that end, we divided our analysis into 3 parts. First of all, we analyze the trade war between US and China and its origins. After that, we analyze BRICS declarations upon WTO rules, and in the end, we we make a conclusion about if there is a conflictive perspective between the group and those rules, and as a consequence to liberal order. So in the first part, we consider that the bilateral relations between US and China. We raise that it has begun historically with the removal of tariff barriers in 1971. And since then, both countries have bilateral negotiations. They solve their problems by means of bilateral negotiations. But since the beginning of this century, there was some suspicions coming from US that China was stealing manufacturing jobs and manipulating currency. So we have found that this is not a concern dated from 2018, but it was previous, and there is an interesting article from Neil Hughes in 2005 analyzing this assumption in which some sectors, economic sectors of American people believed that China was promoting a yuan undervaluation, was selling products by unfair prices, and China was violating the worker rights and failing to accomplish to WTO rules. So this was already a concern in 2005. It's interesting because according to this author, this was not true that China was stealing their jobs, because he raises that there was an investment relations between US and China, and particularly taking into consideration that labor market, American investors were benefiting from the social conditions of China, because most part of the investments were made by American enterprises. So there is another interesting article. It's written by Justin Pierce and Peter Scott, which they say that there was an extension to China by the permanent normal trade relations. Before that, the tariff policies of US dependent on approval on an annual basis, and in order to transfer the capital production to China, it was removed. So there was previously to that, there was a plan of United States. The developed countries, usually they are based on services, and they profit from globalization, from transferring the production and social impacts, of course, to developing countries, and they are also benefiting from that. But we raised all the circumstances in order to show that even though trade war has been expressed in trade terms, tariff terms, there was another economic relations behind that, properly investment relations, the relations in which put in contact investors from one country to the developing country. So until that time, 2005, the circumstances could be solved, even with the suspicions, by means of bilateral agreements. It is the case of the bilateral agreement to textile industry in 2005, but in 2018, some institutions in US gave support to the American vision of America First. It was particularly, we mentioned two reports. one made by the Office of the United States Trade Representative, which said that particularly in investment relations, China was not playing a fair game because it was requiring technological transparency for the investors, from the investors. And this is what we call performance requirements. It's a circumstances where the country which hosts the investor make a requirement for the, is not aligned to the WTO rules. And also they said that there was a weak protection for intellectual property rights. So this is a first report. It was delivered to Trump, to the President Trump. And there was a second report made by US Treasury in which China was considered a manipulator of currency. So this both reports gave support to the U.S. Unilateral measures, as we know, of rising tariffs for 25% of 200. Oh, I'm sorry, no, I don't. But to 25%, and as a response, China has also raised the tariffs to 25% of $50 billion. So this is what we know as the trade war. It is diminished nowadays because both countries has concluded an agreement. It's called Phase 1 agreement. It is that it covers areas particularly interesting for investments because it rules intellectual property and performance requirements, as it is the case of technological transference. So the situation nowadays is a little diminished because of some bilateral negotiations, but this is what we understand as the trade war between both countries. So now I will give the floor to Professor Nantala to move to the second part.
Very well, thanks, Emilio. My part of the paper is to analyze a little bit of the BRICS perspective on the global environment and the multilateral world, but taking a closer look into what the countries, how those countries really use the multilateral organizations and multilateral platforms that we have available nowadays, mainly as we are talking about trade war, mainly WTO. Well, we know that since the beginning of the millennium, Doha round had a very a difficult path to move on, because everything that was said was really not that easy to overcome. The obstacles were not easy, and this is why Doha round has not succeeded until today to diminish barriers and tariffs in some subjects that we are still stuck in a deadlock since 2001. And what has occurred since that is that this so-called MEGA agreements were starting to be negotiated, as we have seen Europe, United States, TAPES, and the Trans-Pacific, the Trans-Atlantic agreements, and all those MEGA agreements were negotiated because of the lack of efficiency in WTO negotiating that, or being the best forum to negotiate all those difficult matters that it would have to overcome. We normally say, or we normally listen, that the greatest villains of this deadlock is agriculture issues, and also, but we also see many difficulties in services and intellectual property and and other subjects that are also causes of this deadlock. And in this view, in this scenario, we have only one general agreement, only one MIGA agreement was duly signed. It was really in November, I think, 2020. That was the RCEP, the ASEAN agreement, signed here in November of 2020. The T-types, the TTP, or the transatlantic, the transpacific, the TISA, which was really focused on services, and the agreement between Mercosur and European Union on tariffs lower, to make tariffs lower, to make easier investment between parties of those blocks, of those groups. They are all still in negotiation. So even when you leave the multilateral platforms, when you try to do it in interregional mechanisms, or when you try to do it more in a regionalistic view, you have difficulties because the subjects are harsh. And when we talk about BRICS and how BRICS look at this whole panel, or this whole scenery, we see that BRICS, in all their joint declarations, in all their joint events after the summits, the annual summits that we have every year, they normally state that the greatest role on this scenario is of the WTO. The multilateral platform, the multilateral mechanisms are normally mentioned as the due one for the developing and developed countries to flourish, to develop. So this is very interesting, because even BRICS being posting a critical view on the multilateral, on many multilateral organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF. In the WTO case, the criticism is a little bit lighter. There is some criticism, some recent criticism that we found in the last joint declaration of the BRICS, in which all countries referred to that WTO DSB, dispute settlement body, they clearly stated that it should be a little bit more transparent for developing countries. But the criticism is mild if compared to IMF, if compared to World Bank. As we have seen, BRICS started a non-bank of all 5 countries, and looking forward to expand it to other developing countries, which is the Development Bank, the NDB. So, and also, but if you take a closer look beyond those declarations and those joint declarations, we also see that we can easily confirm that BRICS are great users of WTO DSB. And we can see that, for example, even Russian Federation, which is a newbie in the DSB, they have already 17 cases, 8 as complainant, 9 as defendant. Brazil is a great litigator. We have 33 cases as complainants and 17 as defendants. India has 24 cases as complainant and 32 cases as defendant. China has 30 cases as complainant and 45 as defendant. So 75 cases only held by China. And South Africa has no cases as complainant and only five as a defendant. And this is very interesting because the common opponents, the best, the greatest opponents of all BRICS countries, more Russia, Brazil, India, and China, are USA and European Union. They're their most common opponents in those cases. So it really shows how BRICS look at that WTO as a way to challenge richer economies or to challenge richer countries or richer regions in order to get some fair treatment of tariffs or something like that. They are also defended, so they are also they have been questioned also in WTO regarding their own tariffs and their own perspectives, but they really rely upon WTO for this role, and this is why they keep. This seems to be why they keep mentioning WTO as the best platform for the development of multilateral world and a more pluralistic world in terms of trade. We can see as well that intra-BRICS litigation in the SB, we have 7 cases. We have the first one is from 1999 between India and South Africa and pharmaceutical issues. It was only a consultancy, but it didn't start really a litigation, but it started a consultancy in WTO. Afterwards, in 2001, there was another consultancy on jute started from India against Brazil. Then in 2012, Brazil started a case against South Africa on frozen meat, which also was only a consultancy. I don't know if you are all aware of how things really work in WTO DSB, but normally no. It starts with the consultancy. Then, if the parties fail to reach a settlement, it can arrive at a panel where we would have a judgment upon the controversy. In 2015, Chinese Taipei started a consultancy also on technology, USB technology against India, only a consultancy as well. In 2018, Brazil and China had almost a litigation, but stopped in a settlement on sugarcane. And in 2019, Brazil started a consultancy against India also upon sugar, and it is nowadays in a panel. I think that in 2021, we will have a first conclusion of the panel on this matter, and also another litigation between Chinese Taipei and India on technology here in 2019. We also have a panel. So from the seven cases that we have in WTO in intra-BRICS disputes, only 2 reached a panel. So even when BRICS countries among themselves look for WTO to raise issues, they normally settle before reaching a panel. So this shows how BRICS countries rely upon the WTO and why they keep this perspective. I don't know if Emilio wants to bring any more comments upon that to conclude our presentation and our paper.
It's just a short conclusion because I know that our time is very short. We identified that there is no direct conflict between BRICS countries because of they support WTO, and even after a trade war, this is not a direct conflict, but we do believe that in case of trade war, for example, there is a necessity of interconnecting investment relations with trade relations, and perhaps a diversification of developing countries' demands is a conflictive point because reality of developing countries are extremely complex. So we believe that this is the only focus that we could consider as a conflictive perspective, but not, this is not directed. The group doesn't direct concerns contrary exactly to WTO norms. Thank you for your attention. And again, it was a pleasure for us.
Thank you, Emilio. Thank you, Joyce Mantala. Mr. Walter, you have any remarks?
Yes, thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. And I think you raise a really important point. Actually, I think there were two really important points. The first one, I think, was that this controversy about trade and the conflict between China and the US, and also the conflict between the US and the BRICS more generally, although I think it's mostly with China, that didn't start with Trump, but it started much earlier. And I think that's a really, really important point to keep in mind. It's nothing new. And I think this also means that it's not going to be over anytime soon. And we see it already in the Biden administration. You know, I mean, these problems are not going completely away. I think the tone will be very different, and that is already, you know, something. But I think some of the fundamental issues are there to stay, and I think it's something that the world needs to grapple with. And the second point I think that you made that was really important is that, you know, I mean, there's so many interconnecting ways in which the BRICS and the US, but also other sort of the EU and so on, other big players are connected. That really, and sort of they have this common institution, the WTO, that is set up to regulate conflicts. So you would think that this is really a good setup to solve conflicts and so on. I think the key point is that, you know, there's increasing research that shows that WTO and especially its dispute settlement mechanism, as you mentioned very convincingly, has been very effective in also giving smaller countries a voice. And the BRICS are not really small, but there are actually smaller countries, but also like the less developed countries, the emerging economies and so on, versus like the more developed that used to sort of call the shots, right? And I think in that sense, the WTO has been hugely successful. But one interpretation of, you know, the US's sort of, especially under Trump, really, I mean, the Trump administration really set out to kill the dispute settlement mechanism. And one interpretation is that, you know, the BRICS and the developing countries have become too successful in a way, right? So, so even though I think it's a fair way to settle disputes, and then there's still debates on sort of how fair is it and so on. But there's actually quite some research now that shows that it's no longer really just the big countries that win in these disputes. But perhaps then, you know, the US is only willing to support these institutions as long as it dominates, right? And that then I think raises questions for the long run. What does this then mean systemically in terms of support for the global institutions that underpin the liberal order more generally, right? So I think in that sense, your presentation really made some really important points that are really very important to keep in mind in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Walter, for your kind observation. Now I'd like to invite the next presenter, the next speaker, Swati Kumari. Swati Kumari is a doctoral candidate from Jawaharlal Nehru University. So Swati Kumari is here. So Kandi, yes.
Hello.
Thank
Hello.
you.
Voice
Yes.
check. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible. Now the floor is yours. Please take it over.
Sir, and yeah, thank you, Sandeep sir, and thank you, Chess, for being here to attend this international conference, today's international conference. The title of my paper is Liberal International Order, Its Decline and Pandemic. So I begin. The end of Second World War marked the beginning of the liberal international world order as we know it. Since 1945, democracy and capitalism have been embraced by an increasing number of countries, including
I think there is a disturbance in network. So Swati, kindly unmute yourself. Swati, kindly unmute yourself. Yes.
yeah, I think technology is failing me. Anyways, including the former communist bloc as well. The United States and the West built a multifaceted and a sprawling international order organized around economic openness, multilateral institutions, security cooperation, and democratic solidarity. The establishment of Bretton played a major role in internationalization and globalization, which was a practical implementation of the liberal ideology that dominated the international world. As a result of which, many developing countries could reap the fruits of liberalization and globalization around the world. It has been seen that the integration into global economy tripled the per capita income in the initial days and improved the life expectancy of people. Here, if I can be a bit crass, the idea behind liberal international order was to give up some sovereignty in the name of peace and to build economic prosperity through the rule-based system, the policies of which were dictated by powerful institutions. The liberal world order was underwritten by the United States, making it the so-called first citizen, has faced visible challenges from recent events. The election of a president who was actively hostile towards liberal internationalism and who effectively brought the role of US as a leader of the liberal world to an end. The contradictory policy of US, which befriends Saudi Arabia, but seeks to establish democracy in other weaker countries like Libya and Afghanistan. Simultaneously, in Europe, Britain's decision to exit European Union, the trade wars between US and China, populist opposition to immigration and refugees from war-torn countries of the Middle East, which leads to xenophobia and violence, increased authoritarianism, which shifts the international balance in favor of tyranny, illiberal trends used by countries like Poland, Turkey, Russia, Brazil, Hungary, etc., all of which point to a gradual shift of power and wealth from the West to the East, which have undoubtedly proved that the crisis in the current system is very real. Against this background, the ongoing crisis of the COVID-19 affects the global politics and the liberal world order in complex ways. Perhaps the paradox of the pandemic is that it very much thrives on the forces, on the back of the forces that shape up the current system. On the other hand, the rolling back of social securities and the abysmal state of healthcare systems in neoliberal age of austerity, privatization, considerably undermined the capacity of societies and states to respond promptly and adequately. Nevertheless, the measures taken by states to curb the virus required significant parts of the global economy to come to a standstill with signs of impending recession. Liberal values, institutions, and democracies came under considerable stress, with increasing government controls, and in some cases, leaders obtaining emergency powers like, for example, Peru, Hungary, Zimbabwe, lockdowns, heightened surveillance, restricting personal and civil liberties of the people. These trends of authoritarianism, protectionism, hypernationalism are in no way just the effects of current pandemic, but have been underway since the pre-COVID days. The only thing that the pandemic has done is that it has accelerated several of these trends in its way. Now that we have found a vaccine for the virus, can we assume that we go back to the days of liberalization and openness? Is the question that I guess lingers in everyone's mind. Experts and academicians alike have predicted that it won't be possible due to multiple reasons. Of course, time will show if these forecasts come true, but for the sake of discussion, I'll just mention a few. First, because states have seen the risk to integrated supply chains and are now trying to diversify supplies and go local for their needs. Second, despite the incentives to cooperate during the pandemic, most states went their own way in their response. The ongoing crisis in Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Hong Kong, Venezuela, I'm just naming a few, have given rise to refugee crisis, authoritarianism, nationalism, increasing inclinations to the far right spectrum of the politics, racism, xenophobia, all of which have led to the decline of freedom index throughout the world, which according to Freedom House, it has been in the 15th consecutive year of decline and set to further go down. In the end, I would like to conclude and I would like to give my own argument. The need of the hour is wholehearted, transparent, and honest cooperation with the ideals of equality, mutual respect for race, religion, and region. Along the concerns for sustainable development, inclusive growth, preventing nuclear proliferation, and weapons of mass destruction, the focus should also now include diseases of mass destruction, DMD. The world and the liberal world order is perhaps facing the most formidable challenge of the contemporary times, but the practical and more rational way out of it would be leaving the petty differences behind and focus towards collaboration of policies on global level, encouraging dialogue, deliberation, and true democratic deals. Preserving the gains and benefits of cooperation would be a win-win for both state and the non-state actors. The nature has shown us that it does not discriminate and when it gears up to balance itself out, the only possible option mankind has is cooperation and collective action. Thank you. This is the end, and over to you, Sandeep sir.
Thank you, Swati. As I said earlier, that Swati is very, very eloquent, as well as articulate about her topic, and the way she touched upon the various issues, the current challenges, especially those who are the drivers, who are the anchors of this liberal order since 1945. So you really demonstrated in your paper that how the immigration policy, how the European countries are getting more and more xenophobic in that sense. So this is a question, the question from those who are the founder of this order. So thank you, Swati. Now I welcome to, I invite to Professor Walter. Have any remarks on Swati? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Swati, for this very interesting and eloquent paper. I really like that. I think you laid out very nicely what the challenges are and also what the risks are, right? And sort of, I think this question of, can we go back to the status quo ante? Like, can we go back to where we started? And how do we get there? I mean, that's like one of the most important questions I think we're facing right now. And I think your paper addresses just right that. I think that was very good. But I think you also point out really perceptively like why it's going to be hard, right? States have seen sort of the risks that come together with global. There's many, benefits of global value chains and so on, but of course you suddenly depend much more on each other, and that became really clear during the pandemic. And I think this observation that the countries went their own way in a crisis situation, I think that and the rise of racism, I think that all goes hand in hand, right? I think the crisis hit in a situation where nationalism was already on the rise. And I think that makes it double hard to address. Because I think sort of your plea for cooperation, I really share that. I think it's the only way that we can actually, persist and that needs to be done. At the same time, it's really hard to achieve that. Right. And I think the more and more nationalism is taking hold, the more and more the foundations of multilateralism are being eroded. Now, let me take an example. I mean, one of sort of the canonical models that we learn in international relations is the prisoner's dilemma, right? Where you have these two people and they can either cooperate or not cooperate. Like the best outcome clearly is that both cooperate, right? But the worst outcome for each of them is if one cooperates and the other doesn't. And then both cannot cooperate either. The best outcome, unfortunately, is for you to cooperate while for you not to cooperate while the others cooperate. Now, if you think, for example, of the whole vaccine debate, for example, that's taking place in, between the US, the UK, and the EU, for example, you can see this in a way as sort of, as long as everybody's playing by the rule, exporting supplies and so on, everything's fine. And then it actually makes sense for you as an individual country to say, look, we're gonna import everything, but we're not gonna export. Right? So basically what the UK has been doing, because the UK has actually been importing a lot of stuff from the EU, but 1/3 of all jabs administered in the UK came from the EU. The UK has also been sending supplies because some of them are very sort of high tech to the EU. But of course, that gives the UK, in this case, for example, the best of all worlds, right? They benefit from the cooperation and supply and can export, but they don't have to export themselves, and they can keep it all to themselves. Now that's the prisoner's dilemma situation where you defect, but everyone else cooperates, right? Now the problem is that leaves the others in the worst possible space, in this case, the EU. And I think the EU has shown that it would like to cooperate, but if everybody else defects, then it's better to defect yourself. And I think that's really the problem. I think you described that really nicely, that there's a really high risk in this situation that we might end up in a defect situation, even though nobody wants it. And then I think the problem is, how do we get out of this again? And I mean, I'm worried that building up the trust that you need to come back to cooperative equilibrium is hard. And once it's easy to destroy, it's hard to build it back up. And so that's, I think, my concern. And I mean, I think all the reason for cooperation that you list are really, I mean, they're powerful. They explain why it's really important. Yet at the same time, I think these dynamics, I mean, this very simple prisoner's dilemma model really suggests that there will be powerful also obstacles in the way. Right? So in that sense, I think you tackle really like one of the key issues, right? Sort of what will happen after the pandemic, and can cooperation be reestablished? And I really like that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mom.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Walter, for your extensive and analytical observation on Swati paper. And you really mentioned that there's no win-win situation. Every nation states are going to be lose. We have the loser, especially in this during the era of hyper-nationalism, and during the era of insecurity. Each and everywhere there is insecurity. So might be safe in the nation states, but what about the ecological? No, what about the technological disruption? What about the ecological effect? So nation states boundary cannot save us properly. So that's your point is very, very insightful, Professor Walter, in that sense. That yes, there is a prisoner dilemma is also here, but we need to cooperate. And that's very, very difficult for the cooperation, because it's a destroy to the peace order is very easy, but to forge a cooperation alliance, to forge the cooperative ecosystem, that's very difficult. And that is the dream of the liberal order. So thank you so much, Professor Walter, for your remarks. Now, once again, I can see Professor Tom Sharma here. So now the next speaker, we have Sonia Burghill. She is assistant professor, and especially she's coming from psychology department. So we will be benefited from her psychological perspective on this liberal order. So Sonia, you are most welcome here. I'm pleased to see your floor. Please take it over. Thank you, ma'am, and Tom Sharma, ma'am, for here.
Hello. Am I on?
Yes, sure. Yes. Yes, Sonia, please.
Okay. So, very good afternoon. A very good afternoon to all of you, all those who are present here. And before I start my presentation, I would like to thank Dr. Sandeep Tripathi for entertaining my paper, which is, I think it is the only paper which is interdisciplinary in nature. So, if I'm not wrong. So, thank you, Dr. Tripathi, for giving me a chance to participate in this conference and presenting my views. Before I say anything about nationalism, I must pay my reverence to our national heroes, Shahid Bhagat Singh, Shahid Rajguru, and Shahid Sukhdev ji, who laid their lives for the independence of our country. It is their martyrdom day today. That's 23rd March. So again, I pay my reverence to them. Sir, I have to share my screen as I'm presenting through a PPT.
Okay, Soumya, I'm making you host. Okay, then you will be in a position
Yeah,
to share a PPT. I'm making you host. Just a minute.
okay.
One minute. Soumya, can you mail me your PPT so that I could open from my mail ID? Because there is no, I'm not yes, seeing the option of
Okay, is there a
host.
problem? Should
Yes.
I? Okay,
So
okay,
you can mail me if.
I think it's going to take a little time. So your mail ID.
Just
a minute.
I'm mentioning the chat box. Yes. You can see mail ID from the chat box. Soumya, kindly unmute yourself. Soumya, unmute yourself. Soumya, kindly unmute. Okay.
It's
you can send me
yes, I have unmuted myself. I'm just sending you the PPT.
Sorry for this break. 1 minute. Start again.
I apologize to all the participants for this inconvenience. I think I should have foreseen this. GNA space.
Yes, it's small. Okay.
Okay, sir, I think it's taking a lot of time, and as I am using a different system, so I think I'm not able to send it. So maybe I can present without PPT if people are comfortable, if you permit.
Okay, sure, you can. No issue.
In fact, so I have arranged my presentation in, when we talk about nationalism, we think of it as something which is it might be a social or economic or a political phenomena. It seems like that. But when we express it as an attitude, there comes the psychology behind it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about nationalism, how it is reflected in the behavior of the individual. In fact, it is reflected as an attitude. And when we say attitude, it has three components: the cognitive component, the affective component, and the behavioral component. The cognitive component consists of the information related to that particular object of attitude. The affective component consists of the feelings attached to it, and the behavioral component is the cognition and affect, how they are reflected in the behavior of the individual. So nationalism as an attitude, when it is reflected in the behavior of the individual, then it becomes the issue of interest for the psychologist and how they view it. So in fact, when we say nationalism, over the past few years, we have seen a rise in nationalism. For example, in the Donald Trump term of American presidency, the Brexit, the return to power of far-right parties in Italian, German, and Austrian elections in 2017 and 18. And then there were nationalist policies of the Japanese PM Shinzo Abe, Indian PM Narendra Modi, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. So all these, the phenomena of nationalism. This is, although we have seen a rise in nationalism in recent times, it is not a very old phenomena. In fact, it only clocked in 1700s and 1800s. And before that, there was no concept of nationalism. So if we talk about the psychologists who researched on this, why it arises, why it appeals to individuals. So we hear the name of Searle White, who called nationalism to be a sense of identification with a group of people who share a number of characteristics such as common history, language, culture, or territory. So nationalism is then best understood as a malleable and narrow ideology, which values membership in a nation greater than seeks distinction from other nations, and strives to preserve the nation and give preference to political representation by the nation, for the nation. Nationalism does not exist by itself, as we have seen, but has to be promoted, and its members have to be convinced to belong to this group. And rhetoric such as "Make America Great Again" of Trump's campaign, or the promises by political parties to bring back the lost glory of the old times. These are some things which try to build upon the attitudes of the individuals towards nationalism, and political parties try to provoke those attitudes and gain some kind of benefit from those attitudes. So if we talk about the psychology behind nationalism, the first social psychologist whose researches I got on nationalism was Sheriff. He conducted an experiment on group identity formation. Nation is also a kind of group, and if individual form an identification with that group, they become nationalists. So he conducted an experiment, and it was in a holiday camp of boys, in which the boys were assigned to different groups randomly, and these groups were given a particular name, color, and emblem in an arbitrary manner, and the groups had to indulge in games and tasks which were competitive in nature. The groups soon started to show hostility towards the other group, which included both verbal and physical animosity. So what Sheriff concluded from his experiment was that the competitive nature of the situation was responsible for such an antipathy. So here he pointed towards the fact that when there is competition of some kind, it can be competition of resources, it can be competition for survival, whatever it might be, it induces the feelings of in-group and out-group. So further on Sheriff's research, other researchers built upon that research, and Billig particularly, he contended that mere classification and competition is not necessary. If the individuals perceive themselves to be categorized or classified into some group, they behave like members of a particular group, and they view other group as an out group. So competition, it in fact just worsened the mutual dislike already present because of the intergroup context. And Billig also pointed out that when groups interact for the first time, the members do not relate to each other as individuals. Rather, they present themselves as members of their respective groups. And this group membership need not be based on any social fact. Just as in the experiment of Sheriff, they were merely categorized on the basis of some arbitrary criteria. So mere classification induces that feelings of group. Only the label is enough. There is another theory which is known as social identity theory, which also tries to explain the potential causes behind this feeling of nationalism and why people relate so much to it. So in social identity theory, the researchers pose that based on the membership in different social collectives, individuals may have multiple social identities. And the salience of a particular social identity at a given time influences the thoughts, feelings, and behavior in that context. Now, need for self-enhancement exists there in every individual. And individuals are motivated to identify with a particular group or groups to have a feeling of self-worth and self-enhancement. And this is particularly relevant to those situations where they find that their self-esteem is in some manner diminished. So such kind of identification, I earlier also said that especially true in the event of economic or social deprivation, which can lead to diminished self-esteem. So to enhance their self-esteem, they begin to identify with nation. And nation is a kind of very obvious group. The most convenient way to build a positive self-worth is to draw comparison with a group perceived to be inferior, or for that matter, that group is made, the group of people which some political parties try to influence, they make them see the other group as somebody inferior, so that by comparing themselves or their culture to that group, that group of concern is made to feel superior. So far right political parties, as we have seen in some countries, the examples of far right parties, they tend to make the group identity of a nation salient by deeming it superior, thus rendering other nations looking inferior culturally or economically in whatever way. So this is social identity theory, where the individual tries to identify with a particular nation. Then there is management theory also. And there are some researchers who said that the concept of nation and identifying with the nation, and with it comes nationalism. So it also gives, it also answers some existential questions of the individual. In every human being, the nature of existence, it is not always very comfortable, because there are so many uncertainties in human lives, and human beings do not know how to, first of all, they do not understand all the uncertainties that are there, that are going to come in their lives, and there always this looming threat of death. So these are some existential questions and existential issues. Terror management theory of nationalism says that it is for these to deal with the existential anxiety individuals develop an identification with a nation. So human beings strive to have a sense of stability and permanence, to have a framework within which to place their goals and values in order to make sense of the lives they are living. So nationalism can very well serve to provide a system of values within such framework, providing a sense of meaning to the lives of who belong. So the terror management theory states that the uncertainty that comes with a fear of mortality and possibility of some mishappening creates an overwhelming sense of anxiety. Subjective reality, which is ephemeral. So nation as a social construct is perceived to be established in the identification with national identity, thus brings order and meaning to a random and meaningless world. Again, there are some more researchers who researched it deeply, and they said can be means basically it's optimal distinctiveness theory, which extended the concept of these fulfillment of existential needs to a little further. And it says that there are two powerful yet opposing human social motives: the need for inclusion and need for differentiation. Isolation or detachment from any larger social collective triggers the drive for inclusion. So when we want to be included in a particular group, when the individual finds herself immersed in an undefined and extremely large social collective, the need for differentiation is aroused. When isolation or detachment is there, the drive for inclusion is aroused. And when the individual finds herself immersed in an undefined and extremely large social collective, the need for differentiation is aroused. These opposing needs tend to balance each other. So it is not as simplistic as posed by the terror management theory or the social identity theory. It says that the optimal distinctiveness theory contends that rather than a simplistic need for enhanced self-esteem or just social identification, search for an optimal mix for the need for inclusion and differentiation, and that group identification does not necessarily result in intergroup bias. So we need an optimal mix of inclusion also and distinctiveness also, and identifying with a particular ideology of nationalism fulfills this purpose. So the function that national identities perform today, for some of us, was performed by other identities. It was not always nationalism, as I said in the beginning of my presentation also. So these identities in the past were being performed by being a member of a clan or tribe or coming from a particular territory. So at that time, those things were important. But the political setup of the world is such that in the place of clan or territory or a tribe, the concept of nation and the political setup of nation has become important. So the salience of such identity is determined by the desirability of a particular identity at a given time. And the modern nationalism, in fact, it is a dynamic process of human social evaluation. Nationalism is the latest stage, preceded by hunting, gathering, agriculture, and industry, and then came nationalism. So modern times have generated the need for a specific type of social and political
interrupt
and
you?
nationalism
Sorry,
fits with it.
Soumya, I'm very sorry to interrupt you. So kindly you can summarize within 1 minute, because the time is
Okay.
getting very
I'm
close
just going to
to
summarize. It is the last issue that I am discussing. Okay. So modern times are such that the nationalism is the most desired political setup today. So hence the needs that were fulfilled by group identity of a clan or tribe are fulfilled by nationalism today. So nation states are responsible for much of the decision making in the international stage and have general control over the lives of citizens. So more importance is placed upon this. So, and as a political behavior, there is this minimalist perspective that when individuals make some political decision, they do not think much over it. They take shortcuts. They use their schemas, and also their affects, their emotions and feelings are attached with it. And so the political parties or the groups that are going to benefit from invoking the issue of nationalism, they invoke it, and they make people take decisions based on the shortcuts that they have found, which we are calling schemas. So the question is, nationalism that I have discussed and the origin, the place where it comes from, the extreme form of it leads to hyper-nationalism. So if it is a psychological phenomena, is it the only option? So, well, the psychological researchers says, no, there is another option. The group identity, which nationalism fulfills, can also be fulfilled by the concept of patriotism, in which there is no jingoism attached to it. And for that matter, if group identity is important, we can have the attention of individuals to higher goals also. And this particular theory is known as common in-group identity model. If we invoke a higher goal, even then the needs of individual for fulfilling their self-esteem can also be fulfilled. For example, there are a lot of problems the world is facing, the problem of environment, and most recently the problem of pandemic. So if we, instead of instigating the nationalism, we can instigate a war or something like a war to save earth, war to save nature. So this is also invoking a kind of group identity, but this group identity is not going to invoke the nations to fight with each other. Rather, it would invoke an identity in which the individuals would together fight with some common enemy. So I think this is where we should take this concept of nationalism. So the other day, in fact, yesterday, somebody talked about cosmopolitanism. So as a conclusion, I would like to say that the purpose that nationalism fulfilled can also be fulfilled by some creative goals, we can cater to the concepts of transnationalism and cosmopolitanism instead of nationalism and hyper-nationalism. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Soumya. Literally, it was so insightful, your presentation, and the way you touched upon a very, very contradicting line that today we are facing. One side individualism. When we talk about the individualism, we just talk about the human rights, we just talk about the rule of law, just talk about the democracy. And other side, you were just explaining the group identity. When the group identity tended to the hyper nationalism, it becomes hostile. It creates some sense of xenophobic idea. So literally, your insightful remarks and presentation that demonstrates that yes, through the notion of group identity, we can serve the constructive nationalism, we can serve the humanitarian issues, we can clinch the humanitarian issues that we are facing. And there is no need to only establish only to the liberal order, which has been established in 1940s after the 1945. Yes, there is universal norms within the nationalism, within the side of nationalism, and that's why your paper is so insightful that creates some sense of vision to construct a global order that is based on the group identity and the individualism. So thank you so much, Sonia, and I'd like to welcome Professor Walter to have some remarks on this paper. Thank you, Professor Walter.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for this really interesting presentation and sort of really perceptive insight from a different discipline, right, into what this is. And I think you make a really important point in reminding us that the feeling or the need to have a feeling of belonging, that's really existential, that's really important to people, and people need to feel that they belong somewhere. So in that sense, I think nationalism, as you rightly point out, can be seen as a deep-seated, like an answer to a deep-seated human need, right? I think to me, there are still some open questions. For example, why do some individuals identify with the nation but others don't? Like, why do some identify with their region? Why do some sort of predominantly identify as, I don't know, Punjabi, and others say I'm Indian, right? Or even sort of beyond the nation state. So in Europe, for example, you have some people say I'm Bavarian, I'm from Bavaria, Germany, but my identity is this region. Some will say I'm German, I'm from the country. Some will say I'm European. Some also have multiple identities at the same time, and you hinted to that. But sort of for me, one interest, like really, like what I don't understand yet fully, also from the psychological perspective, I think that would be interesting to understand what makes people identify with a certain type of group, and what makes some people identify with the nation and others with other sort of areas or other groups. As you say, it used to be the tribe, the clan, but even now people have multiple identities, right? And or different types of identities. The other thing I think is, why does the strength of the national feelings vary over time? Right? I mean, one explanation that you give is, okay, it used to be the tribe, the clan, and so on, and now that's not so important anymore, and the nation state is sort of the most important political entity, so that's why we have nationalism. But, the nation state has been the most important identity for quite a long time now, for at least, 150 years or so, right, in most countries. So why is it all of a sudden becoming more important? Why has it become more dominant over the last, say, 10, 20 years? What has changed? Right? I think sort of from political science perspective, those are the questions that I sort of would push you on, and that I think would be really fruitful to explore in this combination with psychology and political science, because I think what you're providing is really a much needed sort of understanding of this really deep-seated psychological processes that go on behind all these nationalist ideas and movements that we see at the moment. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Professor Walter. So I think there is only 3 speakers today. This last technical session. Unfortunately, one speaker, Dr. Subir, is not here due to unavoidable situation. He couldn't join us. And Dr. Sumant has already done. So I think now the moment we were waiting for the long time to listen, Professor Walter, and we are so glad, and I hope that we will be delighted to have your perspective to listen here. So once again, I welcome you once again. I would like to request you to take your floor, Professor Walter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I had prepared some slides as well, but it looks like I cannot share them either. And I think I'll just give the presentation like that. That's easier than sharing it. So when I read about the title of this session, which is Challenges of the Liberal International Order, Hypernationalism, Populism, Protectionism, and Epidemic, and International Law and Trade War, I thought, okay, that's a big topic with lots of stuff. But I recently wrote a review piece on the backlash against globalization. And I thought that that would actually be a sort of good perspective to talk about, because it really covers a lot of the issues that have been covered in this session. So I'm going to walk you a little bit through my thoughts on the backlash against globalization, and I'll try to sort of connect to some of the issues that we have been discussing here as well. So the motivation is, as we've heard a lot in this session, that really we have seen a lot of pushback against globalization broadly defined. So, you know, both the economic dimension, the political dimension, and also the social dimension. And I'll be speaking a bit in three parts. First, what is the globalization backlash? How can we define it? What is this phenomenon? What are its causes and what are its consequences? So starting off with the question, what is the globalization backlash? I define this very broadly as the globalization backlash is a significant decrease in public, partisan, or policy support for globalization. And that includes backlash with regard to the different dimensions of globalization, so economic, political, and social and cultural globalization. So economic is, for example, trade and international investment. Political is international institutions, and social cultural are things from migration to tourism to, you know, international postal relations and so on. And it includes backlash with regard to different relevant groups of actors: voters, political intermediaries or parties, the media, interest groups, and governments. Right? So it's a very broad definition, and I think it's important to understand the phenomenon in this breadth. One dominant narrative that we've seen on the globalization backlash, especially in Western countries, has been that the losers of globalization are lashing out against globalization in its different forms, and that's why we're suddenly seeing the backlash. And I mean, I think Emilio, hinted a little bit at that, sort of perhaps in the US there have been some losers of trade and so on. So that's really like that there's a big literature that says what's the globalization losers that are mobilizing. And more than a literature, it's also really a very common narrative. But when you actually look at the data and long-term trends in public opinion, the thing that's really surprising is that we actually don't see major shifts in public opinion directed against trade, international cooperation, and immigration, or even like sort of these phenomena more broadly. There's surprising stability. There's a slight increase in skepticism with regard to political globalization, I would say, but other than that, there's really a lot of stability. So then that's puzzling, right? Because it really contradicts this narrative of it's sort of the masses are suddenly turning against globalization. And it also contradicts two observations that I think we can make quite confidently. The first one is that the mass public has become increasingly aware of and polarized on issues surrounding globalization. And opposition to globalization has been mobilized. So globalization skeptics have become much more visible and politically consequential than they used to be. But sort of what combines these two views, this stability in public opinion and this sort of apparent like increase in this awareness and polarization, is that globalization skeptics have always been there, but it wasn't a very salient issue. Now it has become salient. And what has driven this is a process of politicization. So suddenly globalization has become a politicized, a contested, a salient issue. And that's really what's making it really sort of such a big issue in the political debate today. And we can see this, we can observe this by seeing growing contestation, protests, and so on, but also the voting for anti-globalization parties, candidates, and proposals that we've heard so much about today. So if public opinion has become stable, but globalization skeptics have become more vocal, what has caused this? And one big important thing, I think, is that we increasingly see a mobilization of these globalization skeptics by political entrepreneurs, especially anti or globalization skeptic parties. At least in Europe, but also in other countries, at least I think in most Western countries, well, yeah, mostly in Europe perhaps, but also in many other countries, we've seen the emergence of a second axis of party competition. It used to be really, most of this was a competition along the left-right axis, especially in Europe, but nowadays really there's sort of this cultural axis too, that many other countries also know, when you have, for example, also ethnic cleavages and so on. And this has made issues related to globalization more salient. It also has created opportunities for globalization skeptic parties to exploit divisions between the big dominant parties. And that has really led to a marked increase in the success of these parties in terms of vote shares, but also in terms of government participation of globalization skeptic parties. What we can also see is that partisan discourse has shifted. It has become more negative and it has become more balanced. It used to be pro-globalization statements used to clearly dominate in partisan discourse. That is no longer the case. In the past decade, that's really overall is really, there's no difference. There's as many positive and as many negative statements that we can see. Now, that has consequences, although the consequences are not yet as pronounced as sometimes when you listen to the news, you might think. So if you look at sort of like major indicators of economic, political, and social globalization, you do not see a real downturn trend. What you do see is stagnation. And that holds virtually across all country groups at all different levels of development. So from low income countries to high income countries. We see this stagnation that started, depending on sort of which indicator you look at, sort of in the mid 2000s or around 2010, so around the global financial crisis. That's where really things start to flatten out. So it's more a stagnation than really a retardation, but there are two concerning trends that I think really needs to be watched closely. The first one is that we're seeing increasingly a backlash against major international institutions and organizations. If backlash or like countries withdrawing from international institutions is nothing new, but what is new is that really now suddenly we're seeing backlash against institutions such as NAFTA, the EU, the WTO. The International Criminal Court has always been a bit contested. But really, I mean, it's some of the major institutions that we're seeing backlash against. And backlash is now particularly strong in the erstwhile champions of the liberal international order. So the US and the UK, they have been like the core pillars of the system. But now they're really to some extent pulling back with Brexit, with the US's withdrawal from many international organizations, and also sort of more nationalist policies. And that is really concerning. Okay. Now, turning to the second question, what are the causes of the globalization backlash? We see that there are, there's a huge literature on what the causes are. There is this general consensus that major structural transformations of the last decades have facilitated the backlash. Sort of growing globalization, but also growing technological change, and also value change and societal changes, right? There's a debate on whether globalization itself is the main driver of the globalization backlash. And there's strong evidence that in regions, for example, where trade with China has increased significantly, people, we can observe more backlash against globalization, for example, voting for Brexit or preference for anti-globalization parties. But typically these regions are also struck with other socioeconomic transformations, such as automation and so on. So it's not so clear that it's really always globalization per se that's to blame. There's also a huge debate on material versus non-material causes of the backlash, right? So is it economic, or is it cultural, or is it something else? The evidence, I mean, it's a huge, huge literature, and the evidence is mixed. increasingly, there are studies that show that both are likely to matter, and that increasingly also show that these two economic, like the material and non-material causes, are intricately linked. So I think sort of this horse race is it economics or is it culture, is really not very productive. It doesn't get us very far. I think the much more promising avenue is to look at the interaction of causes. When does which type of cause matter more, for whom, how do they interact, how do they cause each other, and so on. And I think that's the direction that modern research is now also taking, and I think that's really where we can expect some really interesting insights. Okay, and finally, what are the consequences of the globalization backlash? I would argue that it's really important to not just think about the backlash per se, but the things don't stop here. As I think Swati really nicely showed, I mean, like, what happens next was really like a really important question that she posed, and I think that's exactly the right question to answer, to ask. I would say that we can study the consequences of the globalization backlash on two dimensions. One is the locus of action. Is it societal, national, or international? And the type of response. And basically, with locus of action, I mean to study sort of these responses and the dynamics they unfold can happen on different levels of analysis. For example, on the societal level, you have voters, you have civil society organizations or political parties. On the national level, you have domestic policy responses. On the international level, you have government behavior and international negotiations, but also responses by international organizations. And on all of these levels, we can observe some responses that yield to and reinforce the backlash, but we can also observe responses that mitigate and push back against the globalization backlash. And studying A, these responses, and B, what effects they have and how they feed back into the globalization backlash in the first step will be really important. So just to give you some examples, on the societal level, we have some dynamics that encourage globalization skeptic attitudes. Dr. Tripathi kindly mentioned that I've been doing a lot of research on Brexit and how Brexit reverberates in other countries. And one of the things that we can see is that when Brexit is going well, support for EU exit in other EU member states significantly goes up. But when it doesn't go so well, like when there was this chaos when the UK first tried to leave the UK and the EU and it really didn't work, that's when support for EU exit in the other member state really plummets. And we can also see this more directly, that there is a connection between what people think about Brexit and what they think about EU exit is correlated. So that's one example on the societal level. In terms of domestic policy, one reinforcing dynamic is that because there's globalization backlash, countries start pursuing policies that are nationalist. I mean, now in the pandemic, for example, hoarding of medical supplies or hoarding of vaccines, but also anti-immigrant policies and so on. But these can then lead to new grievances and can really sort of create problems also at the international level that then create even more backlash. And finally, on the international level, we can see that governments are increasingly responsive in international negotiations to domestic pushback, and that makes them less willing to compromise. But again, as we've heard in the first presentation today, and especially also in Swati's presentation, that also makes it really difficult to compromise then and to really find common ground and so on. But there's also pushback against the backlash, and like there are dynamics that may sort of really sort of dampen the backlash and bring us back to a more cooperative setting. So I'll end with this because it's also a more positive note. And we can again observe this on the societal, on the domestic policy, and on the international level. On the societal level, we do see that some civil society groups are really mobilizing in favor of cooperation and globalization and sort of international organizations. For example, pro-EU groups that have emerged. Or also think of the climate youth movement that's really pushing hard for more cooperation or an international joint cooperation against climate change. On the domestic level, we also have policies that aim at mitigating the causes of the backlash. And one important set of policies here are compensation policies. So we do know very well that trade and globalization more generally does have distributive consequences. There are winners and losers. And the idea of the compensation policies is to compensate the losers so that, the idea is that basically cooperation generates more gains than not cooperating. And we can use some of these gains to compensate the losers. In the end, still all be better off, right? But the idea is if we sort of compensate the losers, then the backlash will be more muted. And finally, on the international level, we see a lot of efforts to enhance the legitimacy of international organizations, both in terms of sort of changing how they make decisions, but also in the way of how they justify and publicize their positions, their actions, and provide more transparency and so on. Again, the idea is to provide more, like a more stable setting and more like a pushback really against these trends that challenge these institutions. So just to conclude, the globalization backlash itself is not associated with large swings in public opinion against globalization, but rather it's a result of its politicization. What we have seen is an increasing influence of globalization skeptic actors that has resulted in more protectionist and more isolation and more nationalist policies. And some of these really fundamentally threaten the core pillars of the liberal international order.
Kindly unmute yourself, please. Yes, ma'am, please.
In terms of causes, both material and non-material causes drive the globalization backlash, and these causes coexist, interact, and they mediate each other. And finally, the consequences of the globalization backlash are shaped by the responses of societal actors, of national government and international policymakers. And these responses can either yield to and reinforce, or they can push back against the globalization backlash. And understanding which dynamics this produces will be really an important task for future research, and not just in terms of research, but I think also for the world as such, and how it develops. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Walter. Really, it was so insightful, as well as you have touched upon the various aspects of backlash against globalization. And of course, this is a very current, relevant issue nowadays in terms of in respective the liberal international order. The way you demonstrated that the kind of feeling against immigration policy, the kind of electoral success of the Eurosceptic parties, especially in the European countries. We have seen in Italy, we have seen in Poland, we have seen in Germany, the sudden rise of the Eurosceptic party on the basis of, on the basis of immigration issue. So this is kind of backlash against globalization. And thank you so much, Professor Walter, when you mentioned that those who are those who are the loser, of course, backlash against the globalization. The backlash, the notion of backlash is just emerged from those, from which corner? Not of course, but the winner, of course, the loser. And one of the biggest loser, I think, the Trump. The last 2016, we have seen in USA how the USA has dismantled the international institutions like WTO, WHO, and all that. So really, it was so insightful, and you have covered extensive area about the backlash against globalization. So thank you so much, Professor Walter. Your insightful remarks on this fourth technical session has been so insightful for us, as well as it was so lucid and clear that the participants joining over here must have benefited from your perspective. So thank you so much, Professor Walter, to be here, and you accepted our invitation. We are so grateful. I once again extend my thanks to you from behalf of the Center for International Politics and Law, ILSA GLA University, and on behalf of the Department of Political Science and Human Rights in the Gandhi National Tribal University. Professor Anupam Sharma is here. I would like to say, Anupam Sharma, to thanks Professor Stephanie Walter, 2 few words. Professor Sharma, just have a few words for Stephanie Walter.
Just a minute. Thank you, Dr. Sandeep. And I would like to thank Professor for handling this technical session in a very wonderful manner, and especially her remarks on each and every paper presented by the authors. And I would like to thank again for this presentation also. So thank you, Professor.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think this is the, we are going to the sum up the fourth technical session. Kindly, there is one participant here, the name is Galaxy. So please mute yourself. There is a proper disturbance here. One minute, let me, there is disturbance. Just wait 1 minute. Yes.
Great. Let me just take this opportunity to say thank you very much to everyone, and also especially the paper givers, which made such interesting remarks. I really enjoyed those. It was very thought-provoking, and I really enjoyed engaging with all of this. So thank you very much also, Dr. Tripathi, for the invitation. I feel very honored that I could be part of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Walter. Now we are going to sum up this fourth technical and the last technical session. Now the next we will have a bye. I think Professor Walter is getting leave. Thank you. So now we are just we are going to proceed this session as a valedictory session. This is of course this is the last session, and for that session we have a very renowned scholar from Brazil, Professor Paulo Borba Casla. We are so grateful to hear Professor Casla to you on behalf of this Center for International Politics and Law and Department of Political Science. I extend again warm welcome to you for here joining us. And I have seen your academic profile. Literally, you have last 30 years teaching experience and research experience in international law. So thank you so much for being here. And you accepted our invitation, and we are so grateful to you. Let me introduce academically Professor Casla. Professor Casla is a professor for public international law at the University of Sao Paulo Law School. He has been the deputy director at the USP Law School, that means University of Sao Paulo, and he has been the president and still is the president Institute for International Law and International Relations of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Currently, he is the heading publication commission of USP Law School Journal. Professor Casla lectures on international law since 1984. So we can imagine so extensive teaching and research experience, extensive administrative experience, and of course the a wide range area of expertise on public international law. So once again, we are so grateful to you, Professor Casla. Now the floor is yours, and you have a 20 minutes time. Please, I hope that we will be benefited from your perspective. So thank you, Professor Casla, and I would like to open your PPT also, as you have already sent me. So thank you so much, Professor Casla. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Sandeep Tripathi. And I'm honored to be part of this seminar today. And I would ask you to be kind enough to put on the PowerPoint presentation I have forward, if you could please. It
sure.
is an opportunity. So this is my compliments and thanks to you as head of the Center for International Politics and Law of GLA University in Mathura, with Indira Gandhi University, and the participation of colleagues from, of course, from India, from Brazil, from Russia, from South Africa, and from several European countries. This is a relevant opportunity and notwithstanding the difficulties raised by the pandemics, which hindered us from meeting personally, at least it is important to keep things going and to hold this seminar today. So the important thing is to move on, and virtually we are able to exchange our views online and on the relevant topics of the agenda of this stand. The scope of the, if you can please move to the third slide.
Is it visible?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now that this conference is verging towards its end, it is relevant to consider the relevance of the matters dealt with during these 2 days. Clearly, the liberal international order is being challenged, and it is relevant to assess where from and for what purpose. The alternatives to the liberal international order are far from being acceptable, as hyper-nationalism, populism, protectionism are ways to raise more problems than solutions, to raise confrontation and tension internationally. The present world condition under the pandemics is additional evidence of the need for deeper and more extensive international cooperation, personal exchanges, and scientific interaction among states and peoples. There are lessons for the future. If you can please move one slide onwards, please.
This one?
India is an extraordinary example of tradition and innovation, of historical continuity and change. For all of us to keep in mind, not only the perspective taken from more than 3,000 years of history, at least, but combines several civilizations, tremendous diversity, and time complexity. The parameters of historical time and cultural context are required for us to understand the world, and same are specifically needed for assessing what international law and international institutions are, and their scope for the present world. International law can provide parameters for the world to be reordered following the impact of the pandemics all over. Cooperation, respect of diversity, humanism, understood in the sense that differences are inherent to our condition, and yet we are similar human beings, all of us. Please, the next. How can international law and institutions be viewed? International law and institutions can be considered as several separate technical dimensions, setting up institutional and regulatory systems of principles and rules, stemming from treaties, custom, and general rules of law, and also from the work of international institutions, also creating international law and procedures. These are relevant features for regulation of the present interdependent world, in addition to these legal regimes. So the lesson is clear that working together is not easy, but working alone is utterly impossible in a growingly interdependent world. There is also an essential human dimension to international law, to teach how to cope with diversity, the protection of fundamental rights, both nationally and internationally, regionally and also at worldwide level under the aegis of the United Nations organizations. The protection of the framework for international cooperation, the protection of the environment and the planet living resources as central matters for international legal regimes. These are matters that no state can handle by itself, and therefore international law and international cooperation becomes unavoidable and necessary. Please, we can move on. One more.
Sure.
Conceptual and operational limits. To the extent states impose upon itself international obligations by treaties and custom, the institutional and regulatory power of international law limits accordingly the discretionary powers of same states. It has state sovereignty. To operate a system of international rules and institutions, there must be limits to the sovereignty and discretionary powers of states as crucial questions in international law and relations. Therefore, concepts like jus cogens rules and erga omnes obligations, meaning obligations that are applicable to all states in the international order, are relevant as parameters for all states to abide by. These are the foundation layers for the development of cooperation to set up international legal regimes reflecting interdependence and the necessity of some more areas of shared life among states, as well as among peoples and among individuals, as we are doing today in a seminar like ours. But the risks of falling back into nationalism remain around. Some of them have just been mentioned by Professor Walter, and also from a psychological point of view by Sonia Narayan. Can we please move one slide further? How does international law develop? International law has developed and further develops out of sheer necessity of the main subjects of international law, namely states and the international organizations. International law grows not because states are virtuous or altruists or have long-term views on common global needs, but rather because they need shared rules for all areas to work together according to their interests and necessities. Where the scope of regulation goes beyond the regulatory capacity of each state, thereby common international legal regimes are required to set up efficient common international rules and obligations due to the own sheer necessity of same states. So that's a very complex question of why international law is mandatory, because it is needed, because there is no way to regulate and operate the international society without international legal rules and procedures. Can we please move on?
Yeah.
One more slide. It is not only a question of stipulating the rules, but also for making sure the proper implementation of rules. As in any organized society, for rules to operate properly, this must be set up and then implemented accordingly in a way compatible with their contents and scope. As internally for any society, also at international level, a reasonable level of mutual trust or good faith or bona fide is required for the proper implementation of international rules with corresponding mechanisms to that effect worldwide. The foundation of international law results from consensus among states and stems from its usefulness to manage the growing agenda of common interests and state needs. Especially for matters the states are unable to handle by themselves, international rules, institutions, and procedures are key features to manage present-day world. Can we please move on?
Yeah, sure. Yes, continue.
International law, Yep. International law can be understood in different ways. You can view it as a series of regimes, or you can view it as a coherent world. My point of view is to stress that the choice about how should international law and its role in the present postmodern condition of the world be viewed. International law can be understood as several legal regimes, more or less apart from each other, whereby rules and procedures are adopted in several areas which are per se international. Or it can also be understood as contents that are materially international in order to grasp the higher conceptual unity of international law, which as a whole, an institutional and international legal regime. Can we move on, please? International law should be universal. International law should not be deemed country-specific or country-oriented, stated Professor Wang Tia in 1990, and also Judge Shui Hanqing in 2011, both lecturing at the Hague Academy of International Law. But both authors, Wang Tia and Shui Hanqing, admit the weight of history of each country as it may impact on its conceptual approach, its understanding, and its attitude towards the application of international law in practice. My point is, and this I presented also at the Hague Academy in my course in 2020, when the central contents thereof become national, international law goes astray. It loses its nature and its role for the regulation of the international context. So this may sound quite obvious, but international law should remain international. Can we please move on? There are, of course, national traditions for international law and relations. There is a national tradition, and Brazil may be proud of its historical tradition of international law and relations, notably concerning the alignment with international law and the use of peaceful means for settlement of international disputes, which has been a standing feature of Brazilian foreign relations since its independence in 1822. Certain features of Brazilian practice and experience deserve to be certainly mentioned, but are not intended as a Brazilian presentation of international law, and especially not now. Under the present government, we are changing some traditional and consolidated positions of Brazilian foreign policy and alignment with international institutions, which are regrettable, and I hope they will not last. Historically, Brazil has refrained from accepting the existence of an international law for the Americas, different from the mainstream international legal tradition. We please move on. One more. The role of international law in history. Along the latest 10 years, I have done extensive research and published several books and articles arguing that international law is crucial for civilization. Its occurrence marks the choice between force and negotiation, or at least a change in the proportions of use of force and negotiation among nations. Between these two, international law inserts itself. This has occurred since the beginning of historical records, around 3000 before Christ, so 5,000 years ago. And more so as the evolution of the system requires more and more international law and regulations for common purposes and shared needs. Legal institutes as the right to asylum, sending and receiving foreign representatives with recognition of their inviolability, diplomatic and consular representatives, as much as the need of same old good faith or bona fide again, in all relations to last, are example of principles and rules practiced since times immemorial to this day, showing important cultural continuities. Please move on, one more. The formation of the international system, due to circumstances of humankind, was necessarily slow and progressive, and remained subject to moves backwards under short-term approaches, like the criticism of multilateralism and globalization skeptics, as Professor Walter mentioned. And these short-term approaches can also bring threats of violence and fundamentalisms of all sorts. International law has accomplished a long history according to the circumstances of continents and regional systems. But clearly there are common and shared elements of international law that can be traced since the beginning of civilization, to the extent written traces thereof remain. After or instead of the use of force that does not lead to a solution among independent political unities or states, which is a concept that exists only since the 16th century, international law and procedures become necessary ever since historical records were started to set a solution there. Can we move on one more? The birth of international law. Clearly, international law was not created in 1648 at one stroke as an entire system with the two treaties of the Peace of Westphalia signed in Münster and Osnabrück, as some people seem to fancy considering valid. People who fancy stating the birth of international law in mid-17th century Europe ignore the evidence of historical records in several ancient civilizations, as shown for India by Kautilya in his Arthashastra. The fact of having been practiced since the beginning of written history 5,000 years ago is the best evidence of its existence, as I call the existence of and the need to view and to understand international law beyond the Westphalian paradigm and it is limited scope of action. Please move on, one more. Kautilya in the Arthashastra, also known as Chanakya and Vishnugupta, wrote the Arthashastra not later than 150 of our era, although the exact date has not been conclusively established. Legend is that he was either a Brahmin from Kerala or from North India. However, it is certain that Kautilya was the man who helped to destroy the Nanda dynasty, as he states it himself in the beginning of the Arthashastra, and to install Chandragupta Maurya as the king of Magadha. A master strategist well versed in the Vedas, he not only describes the art of politics and the art of government in its widest sense, the maintenance of law and order is also an efficient administration machinery. His lessons remain valid today, but also how to build international alliances and treaties to last. That's why some Western authors compare and call Kautilya the Machiavel from India. Can please move on one more? International law, as it stands, is taught more or less in the entire world. Sometimes not exactly the same, but its main lines can be recognized, some shades of local color notwithstanding. These local color oscillations may not change the nature and the contents of international law in its hard core and scope. Otherwise, it will no longer be international. the nationalization of international law in the 19th and part of the 20th centuries produced bad crops. And these are to be avoided, even if we may see some turning up again, as seen lately, with growing nationalisms and voices against multilateralism. The intriguing paradox is that international law is taught, more or less, in the entire world, notwithstanding the fact that it is not always exactly the same in contents and in scope. Please move on one more. No man is an island, wrote the English poet John Donne in the 17th century, means that we cannot remain apart and isolated. There is a growing interdependence and perception of such interdependence among nations in the world. Working together is not easy. Working alone is impossible for each individual and for each country in the world. This is clear for all matters that each state cannot handle by itself, as climate change, as cooperation against threats from international criminal and terrorist activities, more so economic and social matters. All these inexorably require cooperation and international devices for the management of such issues. Notwithstanding that, voices favoring nationalism and also against multilateralism, cooperation, international law, and institutions are more and more often heard. This seems out of place and out of time for our postmodern ears. Not only it is impossible to understand, in my view, but intrinsically doomed to fail in view of the present condition of the interdependent world. One more, please. Will be the last slide. The scope of these remarks. Again, thanks for the honor of making these valedictory remarks. Thanks for the opportunity of having, we were 5 Brazilians in this seminar, Dr. Tripathi and all organizing colleagues from the 2 universities. In view of the foregoing, allow me to state my deep conviction that open democratic societies are those better prepared to cope with the challenges of present condition of the interdependent world. That international law and institutions are the best tools so far available to mankind to operate in the present context of the world and our needs therein. That civil societies also have a role to play in order to foster openness toward the world and global challenges for each of us and each of our societies, and for the independent world to cope with now. I thank you deeply for your attention.
So, thank you very much, Professor Kaisala. As I told you, the participants, that Professor Kaisala has 25, 30, around 30 years experience. And he has been the voice of Brazil. No, it's not Brazil, it's the voice of, the so-called division of North and South, the South block of the globe. And the way Professor Kaisala mentioned that the evolution of international law is not the outcome of Westphalian order, is not the outcome of the 17th century European order. Yes, we can see the roots of international law from the Kautilyan Arthashastra. And the way he mentioned the Kautilya, it was so mesmerizing, especially for me, when I see Kautilya, especially his Mandal theory. So it was so fundamentally unique to forge the cooperation between the states. So that was very unique in your remarks. And Professor Kaisala, the way you mentioned that there is one the sole option of the cooperation. yes, how can we further cooperation? This is because of the international law. And the law is something that is to maintain the law, the norms and the order. And that has been challenged by the main drivers of this liberal order, especially from European country as well as the USA. So thank you so much, Professor Kaisler. Your a very, very articulate observation, a very, very insightful remarks on the this 2 days international conference. And we are so grateful that when you accepted our invitation, I was very happy with your students, those who participated and presented here. And when I have gone through your profile, it was so and so so grateful for us that we are so delighted that Professor Kaisler will join here. And literally, it turned into each and every action what we were thinking yesterday, and it was so nice, and especially for our students and the participants, and the way you presented the in-depth perspective was so mesmerizing for us. Thank you so much, Professor Kaisler, to be here. And now I would like to invite Professor Anupam Sharma for her votes of thanks to this final fourth technical session and the valedictory session. So Professor Anupam Sharma, this is your floor. Please extend your vote of thanks to all the participants, to all the paper presenters, and to all, especially Professor Kaisler. So thank you, Professor Anupam Sharma. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Tripathi. Good afternoon, or maybe good evening to all. Now, we come to the end of this 2-day international conference on liberal international order and its challenges. We had a galaxy of scholars with us, especially distinguished key speakers of this international conference, Professor Shri Prakash Mani Tripathi, Professor Arnaud Renard, Professor Ranjan.
May I interrupt you, ma'am? Kindly unmute yourself. Unmute.
Yeah, unmute. I have done. Is it audible or not, Dr. Tripathi? Dr. Tripathi? Dr. Tripathi? I'm using a different place. Am I audible? Hello? Hello?
I think you are, Professor, but maybe Professor Tripathi has frozen his.
Sir,
I think he is having internet problems.
We can hear you.